Sighs and groans and shrieks that rend the air. In no other play is the content or quality of air as consistently remarked and conspicuously unmarked as in Macbeth. Speakers observe bad atmosphere, but with a hollow sort of notice, one that abstracts the percipient from their surrounds and implies a disaffection that resounds, an ironic distinction, spoken by the play's supposed hero Macduff, between that which touches and does not touch him personally. As the play's messenger figure Ross will lament in a phrase from which I've drawn the title of my talk and which inspired much of my current book project some 8.5 years ago, the sighs and groans and shrieks that rend the air in Scotland are made, not marked. Literary meditations on the qualities of the air and other non-naturals, the category for air and other considerations of health in Hippocratic medicine, illustrate the correspondence between mind, body, and environment in early modern thought. But insofar as air was understood to be both the physical and figurative medium of the play, pneumatic, pneuma, pneumatic representation in dramatic literature uniquely witnesses the correspondence between literary form and worldly matter. In early modern faculty psychology, we find theories of perception as a process through which, quote unquote, messenger beams sent out by the percipient's sensory or intellective faculties interacted the air with sense data, or the term in the period species, species, as well as with the messenger beams of other percipients and what we might call the propulsive intelligence of the object that emits species of information about itself. Cognitive historians and more recently, historians of emotion have explored the distribution of early modern sensory and affective ecologies in many productive ways, but the subfield has yet to attend to the complexity of the role that pneumatic attention and aesthesis, feeling, perceiving, marking air, plays for the determination of collective health and the health of the Commonwealth. Throughout the plays, but in Macbeth in particular, we are invited to attend responsively to air precisely because those tasked with the responsibility for doing so do not. In Macbeth, the punning of air, error, and the errant transmission of power is amplified by a murky atmosphere from which Lady Macbeth will summon murdering ministers and through which Macbeth will be led by a air-drawn dagger. This is the murky medium out of and into which the weird sisters purportedly appear and disappear like, and I don't know how recently you've read the play, Bubbles. In the first version of the talk I'm giving today, composed in the wake of Brexit and Trump's first election, alas, I suggested that Macbeth is beset by the problems of atmospheric murkiness that point to the deferral and deflection of individual responsibility for the rise of tyranny. In the version I am sharing with you today, I focus on a theme that has risen to prominence in my project on there, and that is auditory witness and response, or lack of response to the sounds of suffering, particularly during plague, in and outside of the utopian and dystopian collective. And here I'll pause and say, as I did to the PhD student in the back of the room, that if there were world enough in time, I'd have developed this talk as one that extends the questions I pose of Macbeth to Octavia Butler's dystopian fiction and its preoccupations with empathy and hyper-empathy, often experienced as the ability to hear other people's thoughts as both hypercapacity and disability. And if there are other Butler fans or scholars in the room, or who may be watching this in the future, interested in probing that question in question and answer or afterwards, I'd be delighted to do so. Section 1, hover. Shakespeare's explorations of acoustic and linguistic fidelity routinely foreground their own pneumatic contingency through paronomasia or punning. This is perhaps nowhere more explicit than in his favored pun on air. I already mentioned that air, error, air as an ERE before. Shakespeare attunes his audiences to air's linguistic density in the promiscuity of sound through which spoken language ranges and deranges. This attunement demands a subtle listening that rewards with a keener sense of the very things that those who cite air's supposed vacancy would have us forget. The bodies of the spirits who labor to produce the entertainments in the Mask and the Tempest do not, as much as Prospero would otherwise protest, disappear into thin air. In his seminal work on atmospheres as emotional spaces, Tonino Grifero, elaborating on Hermann Schmitz, defines atmosphere as spatialized feeling. Atmospheres, Schmitz said, are feelings poured out into space. I borrow this formulation to identify the force of its critique in Macbeth. The passive remarking of air in Macbeth exposes the aesthetic witness of atmosphere as a mode of political disaffection and ethical detachment that Timothy Morton regards as endemic to the ambient mode of ecological writing. Morton borrows Derrida's concept of the remark as a device he hyphenates it, that as a device that produces aesthetic and metaphysical distinctions between the inside and the outside, foreground and background. It's a kind of echo, he says, a special mark that makes us aware that we are in the presence of significant marks. In the longer version of this chapter, I show how the repeated call and response of where and there, and I work a lot with the sonority of that, where and there, whither and thither in Macbeth, adumbrates as if by a kind of eerie echolocation, the exaggerated distance of percipients from the troubled atmospheres they remark, a kind of rhetorical detachment from the air here by turning it nearly always into the air there. The soon-to-be murdered King and Banquo's remarking of the sweet air of Macbeth's castle here is a notable exception that proves the rule. The personal dangers of misreading what is here, right here, under our noses, are shown to be graver and the alibi of distance less credible. As ironic as the aesthetic misinterpretation of the quote-unquote good air at Inverness may be, the more poignant and persistent remarking of air in Macbeth is one that allegorizes and generalizes air's corruption as the effect of obscuring responsibility for such. Atmospheric percipients, chiefly as auditors, register air's noxious ambience without recognizing their contiguity, their closeness to touch to its source. I'll give some examples. Whereas the porter manning the gates to the castle names human treachery as the source of the fearsome sounds he hears on the night of Duncan's murder, Lennox attributes these, quote, lamentings heard in the air and strange screams of death to more obscure and supernatural sources, quote, prophesying with accents terrible of dire combustion and confused events, new hatched to the woeful time. To Lennox's report of the, quote, obscure bird that clamored the livelong night, citing some who would say the earth was feverish and did shake, Macbeth offers a taciturn, "'Twas a rough night." The muting of this clamor and thunder in its recollection intimates a mediated deafness that is peculiar to sonic ekphrasis, and which works to implicate the ear witness with an order of moral responsibility that the eyewitness is not equally subjected to. Sound's purported immediacy as compared with sight makes its impress less evitable, even as the vagaries of wind, air, and echo distort or may be said to distort what one hears. The hyperbolic report of bad atmosphere becomes anesthetized in its anonymity. The audience never hears Lennox's clamoring owl. We feel no shaking of the fevered earth that some say they felt. Neither do we witness the king's bounteous and swift horses, minions of their race, contending against obedience as they would make war with mankind. A report so terrible as to make their reputed cannibalizing seem almost an afterthought, except that it seems to warn against the dire ends of mutiny. Despite Lennox's claim to have seen the latter horror himself, these horses eating each other, the relation of these events is obscured and confused in such a way that air is made out rhetorically to be its only witness. As we shall see, Macduff's report of Scottish woe in Act 4, Scene 3 is similarly conspicuous in its obscurity, the irony of which is made excruciating by our witness to the sight and sound of its source in the immediately preceding scene. In his analysis of dramatic prompts such as a noise within, Bruce Smith, the late Bruce Smith, invites his readers to recognize the spatial dimension of sound that is also temporal, to consider what we might call the hereafter, an important word in this play. She should have died hereafter, of sound across what I would like to call pneumatic time. Drawing with Smith and others on Pierre Schaeffer's theorizing of acousmatic or unseen sound, we might ask, what sticks in the air or ear of the plays hereafter? How does hereafter describe memory in and of the play, whose very medium is air? Echo is perhaps the most obvious technique of acousmatic memory in the theater, but it works most poignantly by hinting rather than pointing at that which escapes our notice. Macbeth, in this way, works both with and against the colloquial sense that what is in the air seems to be out of our control. Things loosed to the air in Macbeth, words, images, rumors, seem impossible to contain, but the play also indicts this perception or remark as an alibi for inaction, In tragedy's classical formulation, anagnorisis is the sudden clarity that comes from recognizing the meaning of words that hitherto seemed obscure in their bearing upon the individual auditor. In theatrical performance, tragedy exploits the vicissitudes of air to mobilize the ironies of this key generic procedure and instruct over and again in the importance of listening personally. In the persons of Macduff and Malcolm, the audience is warned not to turn a deaf ear to the sounds of suffering by obscuring them to a ghostly there or elsewhere that does not touch us here and now. In the interests of time, I've cut a long section of this talk on sonic echo in order to suggest that words and sounds are not the only things that linger in Macbeth's air. Linguistic hovering is materialized in the play's more literally foul atmosphere, the air made filthy by the physical and moral corruption of the air, most significantly by the unburied dead held ransom by the king and the proverbial winds of war that carry the pestilential infection of such air from multiple directions at the start of the play. English depictions of the warlike Scots, supposed warlike Scots, seem to naturalize atmospheric pollution in the play as an environmental expression of its national character. Scotland's industrial pollution seemed to 16th and 17th century English writers to be more closely associated with violence than English domestic varieties, supposedly. The play's diseased atmosphere comes into sharper relief when considered in the light of its local environmental and plague histories and the political responses to these crises. As Carol Rawcliffe has shown, late medieval English towns litigated against environmental nuisance, a term that has lost much of its meaning of common injury born of insidious neglect. Indeed, criminal indifference to the effects of one's abuse of shared resources, such as water or air. In other words, pollution as a crime against community. This collectivist understanding of atmospheric injury parallels the medical and religious principles of collective responsibility in times of plague that butts up against more individualistic or atomized protectionism. Surprisingly little has been written on the plague atmosphere of Macbeth. The play is riddled with signifiers of pestilence, from the blasted heaths and moors to the disease-breeding fogs and mists associated with such places in Hippocratic medicine. The play's famous fog and filthy air brings atmosphere into the foreground as the medium in and out of which the witches appear and disappear, as I said earlier, a fog made thicker by bubbling and boiling cauldrons, both figurative and literal, and the optical illusions they conjure against a screen of thickened air that correlates with the thickness of blood that Lady Macbeth hopes will convert her milk to gall, her compassion, that is, to action indifferent to the pains of others. More ambiguous signs of plague are distributed throughout the play. Ominous visitations, a common synonym for plague outbreak, a country under attack by multiplying villainies of nature, swarming, and fortune smiling like a whore. Cries in the dark evoke the terror of night during periods of visitation, a term that moreover reminds of the crisis plague presented by forts of constraint on hospitality and the sacred obligation of providing refuge to those fleeing danger, to think of plague as a visitor. The most chilling of these sounds are, as I've said numerous times and we'll look at more closely, sighs and groans and shrieks that rend the air, that we only hear so named in 4-3 and which we'll listen to more closely in a moment, but have the effect of haunting the play long before they are marked as unmarked by Macduff in exile. He's not there. He's not here. Macbeth problematizes the aesthetic representation of air as the figurative solvent of foul and diseased matter. The affective weight of this distance is felt on the human scale as a response, I argue, to the crisis of community presented by plague. The distinction between the general, or to anticipate Macbeth's phrase, casing air, and the air of proximity to the sick is a crucial, albeit unstable one. When or where does the proximate air that quote unquote touches us all become the air in general? Self-preservation, by distancing oneself from more immediate sites of infection, is, by virtue of air's travel from place to place, an imperfect guarantor of safety from the plague, but it was, as it remains, the preferred method, or what we might ironically call the standard of care. And it was and is, as the play repeatedly underscores, a strategy available only to a privileged few. As Charles Creighton, the early historian of English epidemics, wrote, quote, "The one great rule admitted by all and acted upon by as many as could was to escape from the tainted locality and get into clean air. In practice, the rule was, save who can. Medical directions for the preservation of health that emphasize the choice of air as a primary consideration for selecting a dwelling site assume an elective mobility that was a statistical anomaly and still is, especially for the urban poor. The extended commentary on the air at Inverness evokes this classed concern for the quality of air that determines the quality of physical and spiritual health, but it also underscores the play's sharp demarcations between those who can choose their surroundings and those who cannot. Those who can fly from harm fly as fleance fled, an aspirated, ambient onomatopoetic that haunts a play, and those who have no such luck. Plague serves as an extended, not just metaphor, for atmospheric danger and the ethical scope of social responses to it. The moral ambiguity of flight from infection is paralleled by the tyranny of silence by those who remain under Macbeth's rule. The murmurs of dissent by the Scottish nobility seem muffled, their response to the increasing evidence of Macbeth's tyranny muted and delayed, producing a fog of inaction that seems to me to be allegorized in the witches' description of their own ambiguous hovering. While England was late to employ plague measures of the kind that were routinely implemented on the continent, this was because such orders were typically municipal or local. In fact, Elizabeth's plague orders of 1578 were the first of such to be instituted on a national scale. They bear striking witness to the conflict between obligations to protect those untouched by the plague while tending to the needs of the sick. In the plague proclamations, proximity is the organizing principle for establishing networks of care. But the reasons for this have less to do with neighborly charity than self-preservation. The popular, widely translated Secrets of the Reverend Master Piedmont witnesses a near ubiquitous understanding in the period of plague's airborne transmission. Yes, they did understand that air was that plague was transmitted through the air. Equally ubiquitous is the advice that the way to preserve oneself, again, is to fly. And again from Alexis, I quote, "There cannot be a more present remedy to preserve one than flying from the corrupt air, for there is no other means to avoid the pestilent air, because whether we will or no, we must draw in such air unless we get us away into some other place where the air is not corrupted nor infected. And you must flee far off into such a place, whereas the air is known to be pure and good and destitute of corruption. Neither must you return home again from that place very soon. Hereupon, it is not rashly said, these three adverbs, cito, longe, et tarde. Leave fast, go far, and delay your return." Plague and the crisis of community. Kira Newman has argued that quarantine was, quote, still a relatively new policy to England in the early 17th century. Its effects, she notes, were not classness, and its implementation not always strictly in the name of public health. Beggars and vagabonds already subject to strict discipline and persecution, and my students are always struck to learn that homelessness and unemployment were punishable offenses, were not to be, quote, suffered in the streets of the city in any fashion or manner whatsoever during plague. Quote, "For as much as nothing is more complained on than that the multitude of rogues and wandering beggars that swarmed in every place about the city, being a great cause of the spreading of infection. And yet, public health discourse also recognized the dangers of abandoning social care. Directions for plague management repeatedly note that plagues are costly, but the failure to provide for all affected much more so. Simon Kelway, in his Defensive, instructs magistrates to, quote, provide that no want thereof be in the city, and to get food to those who lack means to get it, for, quote, there is nothing that will more increase the plague than want and scarcity of necessary food, because hunger will drive infected people out into the commons in search of relief." And he continues, "When the infection is but in few places, keep all the people in their houses, not suffering any of them to go abroad, and so provide that all such necessaries that they shall need be brought to them in their time of visitation." And after quarantine, remarkably, Kelway further instructs the town to burn and replace everything at the town's expense. Quote, "Although at the charge of the rest of the inhabitants you buy them all new, for fear lest the danger which may ensue put you to far greater charge and grief." What might seem like largesse is financial good sense. The irrational obligation of Christian caritas is deferred to the logic of collective well-being, to contain the threat of infection by preventing its spread by those desperate for relief. Thomas Lodge, in his 1603 Treatise of the Plague, witnesses the conflict in practice between the demands of Christian charity and public health when he warns against the taking of unnecessary and therefore cruel precaution. Note the language of truth and conscience, modesty and discretion in the long quote I'm about to read. Now the truth is, he says, that our duty commandeth us to separate such as are sick from the whole. Nevertheless, we ought not to use such separation before it be truly known that it deserves shutting up. For in truth, it is a great amazement and no less horror to separate the child from the father and mother, the husband from his wife, the wife from her husband, and the confederate and friend from his adherent and friend. And to speak by conscience in this matter, this course ought not to be kept before that, by the judgment of a learned physician, the sickness be resolved on. And when it shall be found it is infectious, it is very needful to use humanity towards such as are seized. For to speak the truth, one of the chiefest occasions of the death of such sick folks, besides the danger of their disease, is the fright and fear they conceive when they see themselves void of all succor, and as it were ravished out of the hands of their parents and friends and committed to the trust of strangers, who are often but slenderly and coldly inclined to their good. Therefore, in this cause, men ought to proceed very discreetly and modestly. Adjacent towns are required to extend aid to one another in order that, quote, the same infection may be better stayed from the said adjoining places, though they be separated by name. But even as they are obligated to pay for the costs of a neighboring town during infection, they are mandated to keep their distance either by quarantining the sick or sending them away. Those who are able to remain in their homes are to do so under the watch of sentries commanded to, quote, apprehend any person that shall come out of their house contrary to order. Those who cannot remain in their homes must, quote, nevertheless be restrained from resorting into the company of others and are made to wear, quote, some mark in the uppermost garments or bear white rods in their hands. And, to anticipate the cry of Lady Macduff, go where? A proclamation for quickening the laws for the relief of the poor and settling of the sturdy rogues and vagabonds outlines quite the opposite of its titular relief. And I quote, in our cities of London and Westminster and suburbs and places adjacent thereunto, and generally throughout the whole kingdom, there ought to be careful watch and ward kept for the apprehending and punishing of all rogues and vagabonds who either in the streets or highways, under the names of soldiers or mariners, glassmen, potmen, peddlers, or petty chapmen, excuse me, or if poor and impotent people shall be found either wandering or begging, all constables, head boroughs, and other officers ought to use all diligence to punish all such wanderers or beggars as shall be apprehended, and take great care that none shall pass under the color of counterfeit passes. Hostility towards these outsiders is codified as laws policing hospitality towards foreigners, travelers, and the homeless. I continue. All Irish rogues and vagabonds be forthwith apprehended wheresoever they shall be found and punished, that all householders of whose persons or at whose house any such vagrants shall be taken begging do apprehend or cause them to be apprehended, and that they forbear to relieve them, thereby to give them encouragement to continue in their wicked course of life. A private citizen would be prohibited from providing refuge to vagabonds, a social category that includes a wide variety of trades and craftspeople vulnerable to the vagaries of fortune and suspected of falsifying their circumstances and dissimulating not despite, but because of their precarity. All persons, I continue to quote, calling themselves scholars, going about begging, all seafaring men pretending losses from the ships or goods on sea, all idle persons going about in any country, either begging or using any subtle craft or unlawful games and plays, or feigning themselves to have knowledge in physiognomy, palmistry, or other like crafty science, or pretending that they can tell destiny's fortunes or such other like fantastical imaginations. And the list becomes more interesting to me in the light of the travels I've just undertaken these past 2 weeks, an itinerary that reverses the direction of my own ancestors' expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula and Western Europe to Central and Eastern Europe, from which my family would again be deported by dystopian states with utopian aspirations who would deem them undesirables, along with the rest of these following persons. All that be or utter themselves to be doctors, procurers, patent gatherers, or collectors for jailers, prisons, or hospitals. All fencers, bear wards, common players of interludes and minstrels wandering about, that is to say actors and entertainers. All jugglers, tinklers, peddlers, and petty chapmen. All wandering persons and common laborers, being persons able in body, using loitering and refusing to work for such reasonable wages. And all such persons wandering and pretending themselves to be Egyptians, or wandering in the habit, form, and attire of counterfeit Egyptians, i.e. gypsies or the Sinti Roma, shall be taken, adjudged, and deemed rogues. That's in the Elizabethan Act for the Punishment of Rogues and Vagabonds and Sturdy Beggars. And the solution for such persons and crimes of vagabondage? Deportation that follows from the xenophobic logic of the local, xenophobic logic of the local to its nativist radix or root. But first, spectacular pedagogical punishment. A person declared to be a rogue, vagabond, or sturdy beggar in any part of the realm of, or dominion of Wales shall be, quote, stripped naked from the middle upwards and shall be openly whipped until his or her body be bloody, and shall be forthwith sent from parish to parish by the officers of every same, the next straight way to the parish where he was born. If the same may be known by the party's confession or otherwise, and if the same be not known, then to the parish where he or she last dwelt before the same punishment, by the space of 1 whole year there to be put him or herself to labor, or, not being known, to the parish through which he or she last passed without punishment. We can and might say much more about the elusive and ever-receding site of origin of the utopian community's other as a counterpart project to its own nativist conception, but I want to underscore the problem of flight as that which exposes the deadly inequality of voluntary flight. Who could flee the plague? No one infected, or who might be infected, or who comes from a place infected, whether on purpose or accidentally. And I quote, if any person visited due fortune by negligent looking unto or by any other means to come or be conveyed from a place infected to any other place, the parish from whence such party hath come or been conveyed upon notice thereof given, shall at their charge cause the said party so visited and escaped to be carried and brought back again by night, and the parties in this case offended be punished. How and then might a Christian flee except peremptorily, injudiciously, indiscriminately, and therefore, as inferred above, cruelly? The German reformer Andreas Osiander observes, quote, how unwisely and unchristianly they do that out of inordinate fear of this plague, leave their calling and office, maliciously withdrawing the love, help, and faithfulness which they are bound to show unto their neighbors. He laments, quote, that some do shun and fly not only the sick, but also the whole, yea, even the platters and candlesticks which come out of strange houses, as though death did surely stick therein. Where is the line between foolish fear and wise precaution, and what are the ethical implications of the decisions we make to protect ourselves in the fog of uncertainty? We might remember here the caution with which we were instructed to wipe our groceries delivered by essential workers in the early and deadliest waves of the pandemic. That which seems relatively innocuous, shunning infected candlesticks and groceries, is revealed to be more immediately fatal to those deemed disposable because essential, and because of the dangers they may present. Out of such childish fond fear, says Osiander, not only some sick folks be suffered to die away without all keeping, help, and comfort, but also the women great with child be forsaken in their need, or else cometh there utterly no man unto them. Yea, a man may hear also that the children forsake their fathers and mothers, and one household body keepeth himself away from another, and showeth no love unto him, which nevertheless he would be glad to be showed to himself, if he lay in like necessity. Osiander qualifies, or to use a term apt to the play-in period, equivocates. But herewithal, I will also counsel or compel no man to unneedful danger, that he is not bound unto by just calling nor by love, but only warn those which for fear leave that which they are bound to do before God. The iconic heaths of Macbeth's Scotland are not merely suggestive of disease in their atmospheric connection to mist and fog. During the outbreak of 1568, those infected or suspected of being sick were moved by Edinburgh Municipal Council and municipal orders to the plague huts on the Foul Moor, where they could receive visitors and relief only under the supervision of an officer and only during certain hours of the day. Gilbert Skene, who taught medicine at Aberdeen before serving as physician to James VI in Edinburgh, writes, and this is in Scots dialect, when any abhors another in sick manner, as if nothing of humanity was restand, but all consumed, every and any but different of any other. I have some comments about why he's using Scots dialect and what that might tell us about the particular pestilential contextual framing of Macbeth. But I'll say Skene, repeating a popular medical axiom, remarks the greater vulnerability that humans have to infection by members not only of the same species, but of even closer relation, namely family, particularly when exposed to rotting corpses. And this is this fascinating idea in the medical literature that the people who you are most obligated to attend to in the time of sickness are also the likeliest to actually give you or that you could catch or that you could transmit infection to them. You're more likely to infect your own child than a stranger because of the proximity of your blood or their corpse. By such reasoning, the proximity of kinship ties that makes family members most like one another also makes family members most infectious to one another, arguing cruelly for distance in times of greatest threat. Medical and epistolary archives bear ample witness to the crisis of conscience that families faced in times of infection, namely whether to stay and tend to family who had been touched by the plague or to fly from them, demonstrating a want of the human touch that Macduff's abandonment of wife and children suggests. And as we will now hear in the final section when we finally get to Act 4, Scene 2 and 3. In Act 4, Scene 2, we meet for the first and last time the careworn but quick-witted Lady Macduff, one young son at her side, unnumbered others out of sight, demanding explanation for her husband's absence from her kinsman, the messenger Ross. Ross offers what seems ill-directed admonishment, warning her that cruel are the times when we are traitors and do not know ourselves, when we hold rumor from what we fear, yet know not what we fear, which infers that it is her suspicion, not her husband's defection, that amounts to treason. Lady Macduff retorts that her husband's unwise flight will confirm Macbeth's suspicions of him. Ross weakly suggests that, well, we know not whether it was his wisdom or his fear, which the lady rejects out of hand. Wisdom? To leave his wife, to leave his babes, his mansion and his titles in a place from whence himself does fly? The only explanation she will tolerate is that her husband wants the natural touch. Fear for his own safety precedes concern for his family. In the single, lighthearted moment of the play that follows, Lady Macduff and her son engage despite the direness of the circumstances in banter over the exchangeability of husbands and the equivocal meanings of treason. But the tender scene is cut short by a second messenger who stays only so long as to warn her to, quote, get hence with your little ones, to which she replies, more hauntingly in the light of the plague ordinances cited above, whither should I fly? Whither indeed, and how? Lady Macduff's immobility reminds that exile is a refuge afforded to very few in this play, namely the wealthy heirs of Banquo and the untethered friends who share an eerie resemblance to the witches in their ability to disappear into the air, unlike the quote-unquote earthbound Lady Macduff, who states her plight as such, I am in this earthly world. Just before Macbeth's henchmen, murder her son and pursue her screaming to her death off stage. The irony of Macduff's lament for the cries of nameless Scottish widows and orphans is made excruciating by the sonic fact of this preceding scene, the immediacy of which belies the fiction of distance between the troubles at home and otherwise unmarked England, where Malcolm has secreted himself with Macduff's help. Scotland's heir seems content to nurse his sorrow in exile. Let us seek out some desolate shade, he says, and there weep our sad bosoms empty. Macduff, on the other hand, urges his would-be king to action on behalf of Macbeth's anonymous victims, pleading, each new morn, new widows howl, new orphans cry, new sorrows strike heaven on the face that it resounds, as if it felt Scotland and yelled out like syllable of dolor. As if to prove this very point, underscoring the doubtfulness of that which is heard by heaven alone, Malcolm declares his skepticism. He tells Macduff that he will reserve his compassion for more credible reports. What I believe, I'll wail, what no believe. We might explain the coldness of his reply by taking it as part of the loyalty test, famous in that scene, to which he subjects Macduff. But the scene is ambiguous as to when and where the self-preservation of the heir apparent produces his real as opposed to feigned indifference. Malcolm falsely exaggerates his vice and violence, ostensibly to prove Macduff's incorruptibility in the face of such tyranny. But this, notably, is not the explanation Malcolm gives for the test once Macduff passes it. Rather, Malcolm explains that Macbeth has tried to bait him many times with similarly woeful appeals, and that the test was designed to prove that Macduff is not in his enemy's employ. No matter how justified his suspicion of the reporter, however, Malcolm should have no reason to doubt his country's suffering. To hear him do so, if only to test the messenger, makes Malcolm seem as though he, too, wants the natural touch by putting his safety above that of his subjects. Indeed, this seems to be the very point of the interruption of the scene by the English doctor, who announces that King Edward has been delayed in meeting them because he has been administering the royal touch. Malcolm invokes the touch earlier in the scene when he intimates that Macduff is working for Macbeth. He hath not touched you yet, suggesting that only such protection could explain Macduff's abandonment of his family. Why in that rawness left you wife and child, those precious motives, those strong knots of love without leave-taking? Macduff despairs, bleed, bleed, poor country, instead of responding to the damning question, and attempts to take his leave yet again before being called back for the rest of the test that reveals less about Macduff's integrity than his willingness to suffer a tyrant so long as he will keep the seeming peace. The doctor's arrival prompts a description of the royal touch, the laying of hands on those affected by scrofula that exposes the absence of Malcolm's and shortly Macduff's natural touch. The doctor tells the tarrying Scots that the English king has been curing a crew of wretched souls that stay his cure. As if to force the irony of Malcolm's ironic exposition, Macduff asks, "What's this disease he means?" Malcolm answers, "'Tis called the evil, a most miraculous work in this good king, which often since my here remain in England, I have seen him do." Malcolm says he has seen Edward perform this cure many times during his exile, drawing attention to the duration of his stay, his here remain in England, a period that remains unspecified in the play, but lasted, according to the sources, at least 10 years. Macbeth seems to happen in a kind of a unity of time. It's actually a very long time that the chronicles detail. The English king's laying of hands and distributing of alms presents a stark contrast to the failure of the Scottish kings and nobility's response to the needs of the vulnerable and disaffected from the outset of the play, the demand for ransom of the unburied dead rebels, and the analogous withholding of the witches' charity. Malcolm's encomium to Edward mystifies divine monarchy precisely at the moment when it seems most suspect, and he himself seems most out of touch with his people. His lecture is interrupted by the arrival of Ross, whose report amplifies the sound of Scottish suffering in such a way that redoubles the indictment of Malcolm and Macduff's failure to hear and respond to such reports as its very cause. Shakespeare raises the ante on the theme of failed anagnorisis by making Ross momentarily unrecognizable to Malcolm. Macduff hails Ross as, his ever gentle cousin, prompting Malcolm's lament, I know him now. Good God, betimes remove the means that makes us strangers. Malcolm echoes Ross's explanation for the untimely absence of Lady Macduff's husband, enabling echo again to serve as acoustic reminder of the unanswered cry for help. The admonishment that seemed ill-directed towards Lady Macduff, cruel are the times when we are traitors and do not know ourselves, strikes home with added force through repetition. Alas, he continues, poor country almost afraid to know itself. It cannot be called our mother but our grave, where nothing but who knows nothing is once seen to smile, where sighs and groans and shrieks that rend the air are made, not marked. Ross identifies the Scottish crisis as a failed interpolation of community, in which he is himself implicated through precisely such rhetorical obscurity. In its multiple repetitions and interruptions of such instances of report, the play underscores the gravitas of Ross's observation, which we might put in the play's own paronomastic terms as follows. The failure to mark makes for hellish murk, as Lady Macbeth will warn in her somnambulant whisperings. Hell is murky. To mark is to note the specificity of an appeal to a specific auditor for specific action. Take, for instance, Hamlet's "Mark me." The command to mark is a command to listen responsively and responsibly to words intended to strike home. Only after securing Malcolm's pledge of arms does Ross revise his initial report of, the well-being and peace of Macduff's wife and children. How are my wife and children? Oh, they are well, they're at peace. And now he revises. Would I could answer this comfort with the like, but I have words that would be howled out in the desert air where hearing should not latch them. The words he must speak will indeed strike home, fatally he fears. Such words cannot help but stick or latch, and yet the momentary fantasy of a desert where such words could be loosed and lost underscores Ross's ambivalence towards his responsibility as a reporter. Macduff, what concern they? The general cause, or is it a fee grief due to some single breast? Ross, no mind that's honest, but in it shares some woe, though the main part pertains to you alone. Ross's rebuke crystallizes the moral and political problem with Macduff's distinction between private grief and general cause, a distinction whose murkiness is revealed by plague analogy. What hope is there for Scotland if its defenders act only when personally aggrieved? What kind of polity could survive such atomization? Macduff begs Ross to let him have the news quickly, conditioning his attention upon its proprietary import. If it be mine, he says, tell it to me if it's mine. Ross hesitates again, drawing out suspense in a way that stretches the tenuous fiction of ignorance and exile to its limits before shattering it. Your castle is surprised, your wife and babes savagely slaughtered, to relate the manner whereon the quarry of these murdered deer to add the death of you. If I tell you how, it'll kill you too. Despite Malcolm's pleading that he gives sorrow words, man, Macduff speaks only to verify the particulars and the particularity of the report. My children too? Ross. Wife, children, servants, all that could be found. And I must be from thence? My wife killed too? I have said. This stunned repetition is not the kind of salutary speaking Malcolm has in mind. He commands Macduff to be comforted by the thought of revenge, out of which they will make medicines to cure this deadly grief. Macduff's reply, he has no children, rejects the empty comfort of Malcolm's vengeance, which he cannot yet adopt. He will. He goes on, all my pretty ones, did you say all? Oh, hellkite, all? What? All my pretty chickens and their dams at one fell swoop? The soon-to-be king directs his subject to dispute it like a man, to which Macduff replies that he must also feel it like a man, suggesting that the lesson of this scene, with all of its tests, is not about masculinity, as is often said, but rather that the impersonal generalization of woe abstracts it such that we fool ourselves into thinking it does not affect or touch us personally. Thank you.